Welcome to the LNSAC National Symposium Advancing Integrity in College Sport. We come to you from the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The topic? Aspects of the college athlete environment that negatively and positively contribute to academic outcomes.
It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session, who is the director of the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism and the George Solomon Endowed Chair in Sports Journalism at the University of Maryland's Merrill College of Journalism, who spent 4 decades as a sports journalist at Business Week, the Baltimore Sun, and the Dallas Times Herald, among others. Please welcome Mark Hyman.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for that introduction. I am very pleased to be sitting with this group of highly accomplished panelists today, to whom I'm grateful because several of them have contributed to my stories over the years. So without their expertise and knowledge, my stories would have been quite different. So let me begin by introducing on the big screen behind us, our panelist who is joining us remotely, Richard Lapchick from the University of Central Florida. Richard is the director of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport and president of the Institute for Sport and Social Justice at the University of Central Florida. Welcome, Richard. To my left at the table is Bruce Smith, Director of Empowerment, Strategies, and CEO of the ACES Group, who has spent 2 decades as a teacher, professor, administrator, and coach at small liberal arts colleges and flagship state universities. Welcome, Bruce. And to Bruce's left, Mary Willingham, a former academic advisor and clinical instructor in the School of Education, the Center for Student Success and Academic Counseling at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the author of Cheated, the story of UNC's 18-year academic scandal. Welcome, Mary. So we're going to begin with a conversation that actually occurred yesterday afternoon with Dawn Staley, the head women's basketball coach at the University of South Carolina. And we're going to be talking about the role of the head coach in producing positive academic outcomes. So Dawn originally was going to be seated with us on the dais, but she had a conflict at South Carolina and wasn't able to join us. So instead, as I mentioned, Dawn and I spoke for about 15 minutes yesterday afternoon, and I believe we're going to cue that up now. So Dawn, thank you very much for making time to participate in this panel. We're very grateful to you. My first question has to do with the time commitment that we know athletes commit to sports. You know, you're speaking to an audience today of people who follow college sports very closely, but I doubt that we fully understand the time demands of big-time college basketball. What does the average person not see, do you think, about the commitment that student athletes make?
Well, I mean, I think what the average person doesn't see is the for us, it's 2+ hours. We're not on the floor for 3 hours practicing. That's probably the part of their day that, one, they probably enjoy the most. But it's everything that happens outside of that, which is, one, before practice, they'll probably have 2 classes on any given day, 3 at the most, on some other days. And then there's practice. And then after practice, there are meetings that they have to attend. For us, Once a week, they have to meet with one of our coaches, who is their academic coach. And that meeting can last anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how structured and how much they prioritize their time. And then there's a meeting, a mandatory standing meeting with their academic advisor, one per week. That probably is a little bit longer than the time that they spend with one of our coaches. And then they have to meet with tutors, and it varies. Like some student athletes, some of our players like tutors for each and every one of their classes. And if you compartmentalize your life in that way, you know, it organizes itself. Some other players like for there to be just one person that they meet with for the duration of their semester, which you could be spending anywhere between an hour to 3 hours with that person that you are, that helps you organize your day. We also have mentors, meaning upperclassmen in their major that they must meet with, because it sets the tone for them to know directly some of the courses and demands of what their major it's all about. And then there's study hall. Like then there is a mandatory study hall from Monday through Thursday that is at least 2 hours. So I think the demands are high, but when you prioritize, when you make academics a priority, I do think that time shrinks. It's for those athletes that procrastinate a little bit, and most of them do. The majority of them do, that we have to pretty much set their day so they're not missing anything. And then you have to couple that with, there's the NIL space, which is theirs. And then you have to, I mean, socially, they're in the most transformational years of their lives. So we just try to create that life pie of academics, athletics, NIL, and the social aspect of it. And we try not to let those last two interfere with the other two, because it gets out of whack.
So the responsibilities that you've just described, how does that differ from your days? So you were a college basketball player in the late 80s and early 90s at UVA. How does what you've described differ from what you experienced as a college student?
Well, it differs drastically, because when I was a college student athlete, I didn't have as many people that had access to me. And I'm probably a cheat code, because I didn't want to do anything else. I didn't really have a social life. I knew why I was at the University of Virginia. And for me, it was to play basketball. I mean, the academics just came with it. And I do think some of the athletes today, they realize that their hearts are with basketball, and the academic is a byproduct of what they really want to do. So we try to get them to tap into the very thing that they love, which is competing. So we try to get them to compete in the classroom like they compete on the court. And that was the thing for me that I had not tapped into until I was in academic trouble. Like I was on the brink of being on probation, and I never really looked at it as a competition. But the moment I did, my grades started turning around to making that more comparable to what the standard of any student that was attending Virginia was like.
How do you do that? How do you communicate to students that this is a competition, just like what you're doing on the basketball floor?
I mean, I believe this, the more simple the language, the better. Like I just said, like, if you want better grades, I think you need to utilize what it is you do every day in practice, which is compete in the classroom. Like every student that's in front of you, beside you, or behind you, is your opposition. So although you may not know what grades they're getting, just imagine that they're getting A's. So you have to compete with, you know, an A in front of you, an A beside you, an A behind you, and tapping into some of that. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to get A's. It just means that they'll probably get a better grade than they were if they weren't competing in that manner.
We know that a majority of athletic administrators, I'm talking about ADs, assistant ADs, SIDs, faculty reps, are white. Do you believe that that is a factor in the academic success of Black athletes?
One, I think that's somewhat of an unfair question because, quite honestly, the ADs and the SWAs, they really don't have anything to do with the academic success of a student athlete. I do think who they hire, and more times than not, they hire who looks like the makeup of your team, because it makes it more relatable. And I do think, especially here at South Carolina, where I think the people are the most influential thing on our campus. It is from the president to our AD to our SWA to any administrator. There are processes and systems in place that allow our student athletes to really excel in the classroom. And I think the academic advisors and the mentors and the learning specialists, I do feel like those are the people that have the most impact in our student athletes' academic success.
Is it important for those people who have the most contact and face time with those students to be diverse?
I would say it should correlate with who your student athletes are. The makeup of your student athletes, and for all we know, student athletes, the percentage of Black student athletes is a higher percentage on a lot of campuses around the country. So I do think it should reflect that. I know our players gravitate towards the ones that look like them. And is it unfair? No, I don't think so. I think we as adults, we gravitate towards people who look like us. I know I do. Like, I just do. It's just, I think it's an innate thing that we do. It's not that I'm not comfortable with other people, but it's not very many of us. So we automatically gravitate to those people that we have that in common. So and I do think the decision makers on each campus do a great job at making sure that we service our student athletes in that way.
It sounds like you're doing some really interesting things with regard to academics and prioritizing academics. Do you consider yourself to be an innovator in that space among college coaches? Well,
I don't really compare myself to other people. Like, I know what's worked for me. Like, I just finished my 23rd year as a coach, and I'm going to give an example of why I am the way I am when it comes to academics and our student athletes, because I failed one of my student athletes very early on in my coaching career. We lost an academic advisor in the middle of the season, and this student athlete, although I met with her, told me that everything was good, well and good. And then probably a few weeks later, I get a handwritten note that says, "Coach, I can't do this anymore. This is too hard for me." So basically, she was handing in her letter of resignation to say, "I can't do this anymore." And that was probably the most hurtful. That hurt me the most because we didn't have an academic advisor. We didn't have a coach that gave access to a student athlete. And I just didn't know. I was a young coach, didn't know what our student athletes needed. I know there wasn't a coach when I went to school that was over academics. They allowed the people who were over at academic services to provide whatever resources that we needed. So I knew instantly that we needed a coach, no matter how good or bad the academic services or the academic advisors were. I was not going to allow what happened to one of my student athletes to ever happen again. So we made a coach. From that day on, we have an academic coach, and they are responsible for tracking all of our student athletes. And we don't have that coach responsible for every player. Like, we divide our team up within 3 people in our office. We have the academic coach, we have our player of development person, and then we have our director of basketball operations, responsible for some of the athletes who are, care a little bit more about school. And then our academic coach had the at-risk student athletes on our team. So whether we lose an academic advisor or not, we know what's happening with our players every day of the week. So nothing really slips through the cracks. So I will say this, that young lady, back when I was in year 1 or 2 of coaching, got kicked out of Temple University. We had to find her a community college. She ended up going to Community College of Philadelphia to get her GPA up. And then she entered back into Temple University. And today she's a graduate of Temple University. And I'm thankful. Like, it was a horror story that turned great, but it also allowed me to be a better coach and have more access to our players when it comes to academics. So it was a hardship that has guided me as a coach now in my 23rd year. That was something that I absolutely needed to do.
Are there other coaches who you think exhibit this kind of commitment to academics at the same time maintaining, athletic excellence, best practices, maybe we call them, in the coaching profession?
Well, I'm sure to an extent they are doing that. I mean, you almost have to create another form of communication off the court with your players. So, more times than not, the more and more I've stayed in the coaching, the more I found out that our players come to the office less and less. They do. They used to come to our office a lot when I first started coaching. And then as, I stayed in this profession for as long as I have, they come less. It doesn't mean they love you any less. They just have more things competing for their time. So it creates one more opportunity for our players to come to our office and meet with their academic coach. So I get to see them. Yeah, I get to see them when they come to the office with their academic meetings. And it's one more thing for them to know that we really care about them, the whole person, and their successes, like wholeheartedly. So I'm sure you can't be successful in this profession without having access to your players. So maybe it's a little bit different, but I know it's happening on campuses all across the country.
Don, 2 quick questions before we let you go. With respect to academic success among student athletes, what gives you, when you look at the landscape now, what gives you reason for optimism that we're in a good place, or that we're getting to a better place with respect to support for student athletes?
Well, here's the thing, as coaches, we go into homes and we recruit young people to come to our programs, and whether or not it is somebody forcing this question onto us, or they just know just to ask, what is your graduation rate? So when you're asked that question, if it's not 100%, then there should be a series of questions that's asked after that. Like if you ask me what our graduation rate is, it is not 100%. It's not. But every athlete but one has graduated. And I am on her phone constantly trying to get her to come back and get this piece of paper, because she may not think it has an impact on her life right now, but when she hangs up her shoes from the WNBA, it'll come back to haunt her. Because if she ever, and I think she could be a great coach, she would ever want to get into coaching, she can't without that piece of paper. So I'm just constantly feeding her that information. But I will say this, there are some student athletes that have transferred from either Temple or South Carolina that haven't graduated. I don't count them on our graduation rate because they didn't stay with us. For those who have stayed with us, all but one. And I'm super proud of that, because now I can go into homes, and say that our graduation rate isn't 100%. Here's why. But I'm in constant conversation with this young lady that I need to check that box off. But those who stayed with us, have a pretty high percentage. And I'm talking about, there's a 99% chance that they will graduate.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think we're going to be unpacking for the next 45 minutes. Before I get to a specific list of items from that conversation, I just wondered the reaction of the panel. Richard, let's start with you. What are your thoughts about what you heard from Dawn Staley?
I've been impressed with her since I've been following her career many, many years ago. She seems committed to her student athletes as people as well as athletes. I think that to have a Black woman as the head coach, one, we know that's rare. Only 20% of basketball coaches on the women's game are Black. So if your majority of your players are Black, as they are in college sport, in basketball and football these days, then as she said, they're more relatable. And I think Dawn is a perfect example of someone who's put together a team to assure that the holes are filled, if there were any holes, that nothing is left undone. I'll tell you an ironic story is my dad was a basketball coach. He coached 10 years at St. John's, 10 years with the Knicks, went back to St. John's for another 10. And when he went back, he found out that his players weren't going to class. This was 1956. Hadn't gone to class the first time he was there, hadn't gone to class with the previous coach. And he started what I believe was the first mandatory study hall in the history of college sport at St. John's in 1956.
Wow, that's quite a story. Bruce.
First, thank you, Mark, for being here with us today. And thank you, Donna and other folks on the Drake Group board for making this possible. I've been a big fan of Coach Stevens as well for a long, long time. And I can remember sitting in my dorm room in college, watching my little black and white TV, watching UVA play and cheering for Dawn and her teammates then in that way. So it's been a long time. And I told the folks on the board that if Dawn Staley's in the room, much less sitting at the table with me, I'm not going to be able to talk. So it's good that she's not here so that I can talk today. It's really good to hear conversation about the academic advising profession in a space like this. especially from a coach at the level that Dawn is at. And as a former academic advisor, I want to be able to highlight that role and what that work is. And I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to do that in this space today. And one of the things that I keep reminding myself about, and from my experience, and it's been a long time since I was an advisor, but that's hard work. And Dawn stated how she was blown away when that team's advisor decided to quit. I mean, that's a regular everyday conversation when you're in that work. And that work is difficult, and it's difficult for a number of reasons, including the arguments that you have every day, especially with head coaches. And I think that's a thing that we'll want to dig into today.
Mary, I have to confess, I was thinking of you during that conversation with Don, because I know how you lived in that world in such an important way for a long time. So very curious your thoughts about the level of academic support that Don described.
Yeah, I would like to say thanks to the Drake Group for having me as well. And especially to Alan Sack, who 10 years ago, if you can believe it was 10 years ago, called me when I blew the whistle on North Carolina and said, "We've got your back." So I'd like to say thank you. And it's amazing that it's been 10 years. We don't look any older, of course. Yeah, Coach Staley, that was incredible. And I would have liked the opportunity to work for her. But that said, I also would have to say, I would like to see the transcripts of the athletes, because if they all took the same classes and they were mismatched and the degrees were not necessarily what those athletes that aligned with their hopes and dreams, then I still question if it was a real education. What she said and what she does is amazing work. So yeah, but I would have to dig deeper just because of who I am and what I learned at the University of North Carolina.
Yeah, thank you. Don said, I asked her about the fact that most college administrators, as we know, are white, and a significant percentage of athletes in revenue sports are students of color. We know that. And asked for her thoughts about the impact of that. Richard, I know that you've done quite a bit of research, some of which I think is going to be published soon, on the data behind those numbers. And I wondered if you could speak to us about that.
I'd be happy to. And first, I want to just thank Mary for the courage that she showed back when she did blow the whistle, and to say hello to my friend Alan and Donna. And I apologize for not being able to be there today. But it's an understatement to say that most are white. You know, our athletic directors who do a lot of the hiring, I'm just going to give you divisions 1, 2, and 3 are 79% white in division 1, 91% in division 2, and 90% in division 3. The consequences are, among the consequences are the fact that we have fewer Black basketball coaches in men's basketball today than we had 17 years ago. We have fewer Black head football coaches in the FBS schools than we had 15 years ago. So we're barely making any progress, if we are making progress. And I think one of the things that we study in graduation rates, as well as the great work the Drake group does, is the gap between Black student athletes and white student athletes graduation rates. It's been wide over the years. It's narrowed a little bit, but this year in men's basketball, the gap grew from 11% to 14%. It was the first time we had a reversal. So I think we have to keep close watch on that. And one of the things that we see in the graduation rate studies consistently, we've been tracking it for the past 4 years, is where there's a Black head coach, the graduation rate of Black student athletes on that team is significantly higher than if it was a white coach at another school.
Bruce?
So when I got to University of California, Berkeley as a graduate student, I was immediately targeted for a bunch of work with a bunch of different athletes in a bunch of different spaces. And I knew that was for a small handful of reasons, starting with the fact that I was Black, right? I knew the football coach came to me and said, can you be a GA for our team because I was Black? I knew that the director of the academic support service came to me and said, can you tutor these athletes because I was Black, right? And I would learn eventually that my advisor in the Graduate School of Education, one of the reasons why he targeted me as a student is not just because I was Black, because he thought I also grew up poor. And when I told him I grew up in the suburbs here in DC, it's like, you're a suburb kid and your parents went to college? It blew him away, right? And our relationship changed drastically that day. One of the things that Coach Staley talked about was having an academic coach. And my experience tells me that the folks who are chosen to be academic coaches are always Black. That's for a reason. And what that tells me is that head coaches think that they need an academic coach who can speak with a particular set of students, and a particular set of students are Black students, right? So we have to be able to analyze and interrogate that. One of the things I learned in my 20 plus years as a higher ed administrator is that as a Black professional, you have to pay a tax. Part of that tax is being asked to do things that aren't on your job description, right? You have to support Black students. That's not in your job description. Now, I did work in the DEI space, so that was always a part of my work. But I know Black faculty who would come to me and say, I didn't go to graduate school to learn how to support just Black students. But that's what I'm being asked to do. And I don't get compensated for it, right? So that's the thing we have to be aware of. And certainly if we're in an institution where, as Richard's saying, 80%, 90% of the administrators are white, then those few Black folks are going to get bombarded with a bunch of responsibility that's one, not theirs, and two, that they don't get compensated for. A third thing that I learned pretty quickly is that as a Black academic professional at a PWI Power 5 institution, I was not on the fast track to becoming an athletic director. My athletic director at the University of Arizona told me that clearly, right? I said to him, he asked what my goals were, and I said, I want to be you one day. And he told me, you're not going to be me. You do academics, you're not going to do this. You're not going to be able to sit in this chair. That was my first week at that institution, right? And so also in that first week at that institution, I was introduced to every Black athlete on campus, right? So really quickly, the message gets clear, right? So if we're in a space where we're not hiring Black administrators, the Black students get short-shafted, the Black staff get asked to do things that they're not paid to do, and they are not seen as capable as their white peers are.
What if you were an athletic director at a Division I, at a Power 5? We're promoting you to Power 5 conference athletic director.
So I get to sit in that spot where that dude said I wasn't going to sit in?
That exactly. I think that's a promotion, but maybe not.
I can do that.
How would academic support in the revenue space, how would it look different? You're the athletic director.
Yeah, so one of the things that I thought was really, really important was that my athletes have a collegiate experience, right? So it's absolutely true that that athletes in that space are overscheduled, right? I thought my job was not necessarily to help them get a piece of paper, but was to help them have experiences, right? So I would start with that. There are folks out there in the academic space at the college that need to be in relationship with athletes. A hard thing, Dave Ridpath and I have this conversation all the time. A hard thing about that is some of those folks, including faculty, just want to be fans of the sport, right? And you can weed those folks out. And then you got some folks who want to do all they can not to seem like fans of the sport, right? And you can weed those folks out as well, or build better relationships with them, right? And I saw my job as an academic support professional to be liaison between, the academic side of campus. And this is how we talked about it, right? The academic side of campus and the athletic side of campus. We wanted to bridge that gap and find meaningful ways for my athletes to always be in conversation with faculty. Faculty drive the institution, right? And if your athletes aren't building relationships with faculty, they're missing out, right? To me, that's the first job of academic support professionals. And if I were an athletic director, I would make that a primary goal.
Mary.
You're not going to ask me to be an athletic director. So
But I am going to ask you about the role of the head coach in setting a tone with regard to, you know, the importance and and priorities and academics.
I had some experience at North Carolina with a few of the coaches who were concerned. Most of the time, I wouldn't see them as a learning specialist, or at the time, the person running supplemental instruction in the tutoring program, which was quite large because at Carolina we had 28 sports, so lots of students using the academic support program. I would have conversations with coaches not until there was one of their students was in trouble. Right. So when a student was, you know, sitting on the fence to become ineligible, then I might see a coach. So I think it would be a better world if they would be more proactive. It sounded like Coach Staley, you know, it sounds like that definitely would be, you know, one of the positives in her program, because it sounded like that program was very proactive right from the very beginning. So I do think that a coach has so much, power to be helpful to the academic support team. But I'm not sure that that's, at least at Carolina, that's not the way those relationships were. The baseball coach, Coach Fox, he really made an effort to make sure that his students were getting what they needed. So I would say and we went to Omaha for the, you know, baseball World Series, whatever, several times when I was there. So I have to say that he was, more on top of things than a lot of the other coaches were. But one of the football coaches also came to me once to try to understand one of the quarterback's learning styles, because he was struggling not just academically, but also with the plays. And this poor guy was really dyslexic. So, you know, and I would say, what must it, you know, what is it like to be him, right? Because he's struggling academically and he's struggling on the football field as well. So, I mean, there were moments, you know, where I thought coaches did have some concerns ahead of the problems, but I would say more than 95% of the time, it was when there was a problem with that athlete and the eligibility question, unfortunately.
Richard, the statistic that you cited about students of color succeeding, maybe you said the graduation rates were higher when they were playing on teams coached by coaches of color. That's really fascinating. Can you tell us more about that? Do you have longitudinal data on that? What more do you know?
We've only done that for the last 3 years. We've been doing graduation rate studies for much longer than that, but we started separating it out to take a look at that 3 years ago. And in each of the 3 years, both in the men's and women's basketball tournaments, as well as the bowl-bound teams in football, it is held up to be true that there was a measurable difference, a successful measurable difference for Black student athletes who were playing for Black coaches. And to just lay out what that means on the national landscape, because there aren't that many Black coaches. In Division I, 84% of the coaches are white, 85% in Division II, 89% in Division III in men's sports. In women's sports, it's 81%, 85%, and 89% are white head coaches. So they're not going to have that opportunity to get that role model as their head coach that might make a difference. It doesn't, and I'm not saying that all white head coaches aren't going to emphasize academics at all. But there is that relationship between Black head coaches and Black student athletes.
So Richard uses the phrase role model. What do we make of, what significance do we ascribe to that?
I think that's a really interesting framework to use. Certainly in my experience, the athletes that I work with, I don't know that I worked with any Black head coaches. Several Black assistant coaches. And what I could see is Black athletes being able to have conversation with those Black assistant coaches about their experience. I think that certainly is helpful. I think it's also helpful, especially when you're talking about, and I don't want to make the assumption or drive people to the assumption that all Black college athletes aren't prepared for college or come from homes or backgrounds or communities that don't prepare them for college. So that's not what I'm going to say. But there are some, right? And I would assume that those athletes can get a lot from conversation with their coaches, the people that they want to trust the most, the people that they want to trust them the most, the people who when they're being recruited are position themselves as someone that you can get advice from, right? So they're going to go to those folks first, right? And they should. So if they can get advice, suggestions, share stories and experiences, if those folks can serve as role models, that makes absolute sense to me. I think there's also something about expectation as well. And it's and I think like Richard said, I don't think there's a white coach out there who says, I don't expect Black athletes to graduate, but it feels a little different as an athlete when that coach who shares some significant background experience with you sets an expectation with and for you and helps you manage that set of expectations as well.
And I'm thinking about this in a way that I was basically sent back to K-12 right after my whistleblowing, and not that it's a bad place to be sent back to, but we struggle too with, finding Black principals. I'm down in the lower Delta and I've got a white elementary school principal. It doesn't make any sense to me. And we have the research that shows that it would be more helpful if the principal and the assistant principal and the advisor or the school counselors and the teachers look more like the students. So we talk about that in the K-12 arena all the time. The one thing that happened at Carolina that was so unfortunate too, that just pops into my head as we're having this conversation, it was actually the African American Studies Department that housed the paper class system. So, just when you're thinking about all of this, it just gets kind of muddled sometimes. But I do think when I think about the academic support program and how white we were, and given that our athletes are predominantly, especially in football and the basketball programs, Black, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because of the research that we know. It's unfortunate. I also, when I talk about the book Cheated out on university campuses, one of the questions that I ask at Notre Dame and the University of Oklahoma is if these athletes in Division I football and basketball were white, predominantly white instead of Black, would we be treating them this way? So, race does, as someone said, race is the whale swimming just below the surface in all of this. So it's a social justice issue, and the inequities are so blatantly large.
So going back to our conversation with Dawn, and when we were talking about an athlete's daily schedule, I mean, I'm thinking, when do they sleep? It's class, practice, class, study hall, practice. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a lot of discretionary time. Maybe there's a little time for NIL in between.
You could do the NIL on your phone, right? So
During practice, maybe.
Yeah, during class, right? During study time.
We have expectations of athletes in the classroom. Plus, we're on the brink of a conference in which Rutgers could be playing a conference game against UCLA. So travel demands only seem to be, becoming greater. I'm curious about your thoughts about the time commitment and whether, we've reached a point where it's just not possible to be a successful athlete and student.
Especially if a student, and this is in my wheelhouse, if a student comes underprepared for the academic rigor of the institution, because now there's even another level where we're trying to do some developmental work or trying to help them, just navigate a college class that's, 4 or 5 levels above where they're at academically. So we're doing supplemental instruction and we're doing tutoring. And the time commitment is it just seems like we've gotten to the point where, for me, if we could just separate out, if you could do your education at a different time that you play your sport, because it just seems like it's just become impossible. And it was already very difficult. So that's from my experience. And again, especially if those students are underprepared, and so many students were underprepared. And now after the pandemic, we're going to have a whole nother group of students who are even more underprepared, and our literacy rates in this country have just fallen dramatically. So yeah, it's just seems so unrealistic. It seems like a fantasy game now, the academic piece anyways.
Yeah, the time commitment is really, really difficult. And I think, like Mary said, there are other factors that work into that as well around underpreparedness is certainly one thing. And then what's in my wheelhouse around the DEI piece is sense of belonging. I think Coach Staley talked a little bit about that, and we talked a little bit about that around race and representation. So that's one factor, right? Another piece of the sense of belonging conversation is affirmation. And the third is, what kind of meaningful feedback you're getting. And as athletes, there's a number of folks, especially for Black athletes and especially those playing the revenue generating sports. There are a number of folks at the institution where these athletes end up who don't think that they belong at that institution anyway, right? I could tell you dozens of stories of athletes that I work with who were sitting in class and being told by their classmates, you don't belong here, right? My friend so-and-so who had a such and such GPA and such SAT score didn't get in because you got in, right? So there are folks that they're having to compete with, to use Coach Staley's term, who don't think that they belong in that space anyway.
You're saying students sitting in a classroom,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
confronting other students and saying, what are you doing here?
Absolutely. Happens constantly. Right. And I would assume that it happens on every institution, every PWI institution that's represented here. Yes. I did not go to a Power 5 school. I'm Ivy League educated. And as soon as white folks got to campus, right, the conversation started happening. Myself and my teammates were certainly called out for our inclusion on that campus, right? I told them this way, I love affirmative action. Sure, call me an affirmative action baby, absolutely. I can run fast and the institution likes me because I run fast, that's great too. And my mother could afford to pay the tuition. So I'm glad I'm here, right? So there are ways around that conversation, but absolutely, Mark, that happens every day. So when we talk about preparation and sense of belonging and the time commitment, all these things come together to make this thing that college athletes are trying to achieve really, really difficult. I think I like that was said in the earlier panel. I think Coach Mateo said this, that systems get the results that they're designed to get, right? And the system of revenue generating college sports gets the results that it's designed to get, right? We bring athletes to our institutions who may be underprepared, to a space where they don't see a lot of people who are like them, right? And we get upset when they don't succeed. As long as the system looks like it does, we're going to get these results.
Now we tend to focus, I think, and Coach Staley mentioned graduation rates and took understandable pride in the graduation rates at Temple and South Carolina during her tenure. But Richard, I'd like to bring you in on this. Are graduation rates really the metric we should be looking at, or in addition to graduation rates, are there additional metrics that you think are important to judging the academic success of college athletes?
Well, I think as Mary pointed out, you need to look at what they were studying, what kind of classes they were in. Were they in a program that was keeping them eligible, or were they in programs that were going to fulfill career ambitions that the athletes made? We started in 1985, something called the National Consortium for academics and sports that started with 9 institutions, Temple being one of them actually, ended up with 285 institutions, and those schools that joined the consortium pledged that they would bring back any athlete who didn't graduate when their eligibility expired at the expense of the university to finish their education. And in the 30 plus years that the consortium operated, we had more than 30,000 former student athletes come back and 15,000 graduated. This time they almost all changed the majors that they were in when they were in school, have something that's more focused on what they wanted to do developmentally. I think a lot, interestingly, that as the Drake Group knows, the NCAA fought us because the NCAA only allowed people to come back for 5 years. We were saying any period of time, and the NCAA tried to crush the organization, but the institutions went ahead with bringing those student athletes back. And I think the Drake Group, I've had conversations with Donna about doing similar types of degree programs.
Mary, what should we be looking at to accurately judge the success of college athletes?
Well, it's two things, right? So the transcripts and then also the what the student, what they really wanted to study. And so many times at Carolina, the athletes weren't allowed to study, couldn't study the business degree or the education degree because their sport either got in the way or their GPA got in the way. But I would argue that if we allowed students to do what they wanted to do, what they thought that they would be doing following their athletic career, that they would have more success in school because it would be something that would interest them. So yeah, that's we all see it when we watch TV and we watch the games and they put up the majors. What the heck is turf management? And was that somebody's hope? And, maybe, but it just seemed like there were a lot of people in that, or I know comm studies or liberal studies, but I just think that if the students could just pick what they wanted, then this would change too. But for so many reasons, including the time commitments and the internships where they don't get the experience that other students get, then they don't. So I think we do need to look at the transcripts, but we need to find out what that student originally wanted to study. So those two things would be what I look at. And when I look at the transcripts, I look for patterns, for a decade or more than that, as it happened at Carolina. What is everybody taking? Drama 160, it's a stagecraft class. It's for drama majors. Why is every athlete in the history of Carolina taking drama 160? I know, because they got an A and they didn't really have to do very much, but it's just doesn't belong on their worksheets, right? It doesn't belong in there. So we've all taken easy classes in college to bump our GPA. So it's not that, but it's if you really want to give someone in exchange for their talent in education, then it should be real, it should be meaningful, and it should be what that person wants to study.
I think Mary and Richard are absolutely right with the transcript discussion. After I left academic advising for athletes, I worked in more traditional, I would say, student life work. So and part of doing that work is developing programming events for college students, and then trying to get them to come, right? Because that stuff, that outside the classroom stuff, is really important, and providing a well-rounded experience and producing well-rounded graduates. And one of the things that we did in student life was push for a student life transcript, right? And I would love for college athletes to have a student life transcript that didn't include any of their athlete stuff, right? Just to see how they are engaging outside of their athletic pursuits, and also outside of the classroom stuff that they have to do. There's a lot we could talk about the have to piece, but it's really tough when you're overscheduled to have an interest, right? To develop an interest, to try to take a risk, right? And along those lines, another thing I think that I would want to be able to talk about when we get to this part of the conversation is interest. What are athletes interested in, right? One of the most heartbreaking moments I ever had was sitting with an incoming athlete and asking that athlete, he's a basketball player, and asking that athlete, what are you interested in? What do you want to know about? And he said, nothing. And I said, wait a minute. There's nothing in this world that you would like to ask questions about or know more about. Nothing that you read about. No, not really. And I asked him, what about basketball? I just want to play. Right? It was extremely heartbreaking. And it wasn't just about that student, right? It's about, again, the system. And one of the things that we do, especially for the highest performing athletes, is convince them that their only interest is their sport, right? And that it's dangerous to have outside interests, right? I get to coach high school age AAU basketball now. And one of the things that I work really hard with my athletes on is that you're a basketball player and a bunch of other stuff. And I don't get to tell you what all that other stuff is, right? You get to decide that, and it's a choice. And what happens more often is that coaches, family, other people who are in those students' lives convince them not to take risks, not to try to have an interest, because you might fail at that thing. And failing at that thing is dangerous when you have a goal of being a Division I athlete and a professional athlete, right? And then when you get to college and you end up in the classes where you can get A's, because nobody wants you to fail, right? No one wants you to take a risk. And one of the things that we know as educators, everyone in this room knows that failure is one of the greatest teachers of lessons, right? And I really, I think one of the disservices that we do for our athletes, especially football players and men's and women's basketball players, is protect them from failure.
We heard from Don, and we've heard from others today, ex-athletes who've said, seems to me every one of them has said, I wish I had taken my academic career more seriously. I wish I had valued the opportunity I had in the classroom. What can we do about that? I mean, is it just human nature and we give up on that? Or is there a way to communicate to athletes, college athletes, while they're college athletes, that there's tremendous value in the classroom, and they ought to recognize that?
Okay, I'll start. Yeah. One way to, one entry point into that, an answer to that question, is to think that I don't think that even for the athletes that expressed very little interest in learning something new, they understood the value of academic pursuits, right? And at the same time, they found themselves in a system, an ecosystem, if you will, that was incredibly controlling on them, right? And being able to exist within that system, exist within that environment, to temper down your interests to the point where you say you don't have any, leads you to not want to take those classes that you might be interested in, right? I would also assume that every one of us in this room who has completed college can remember a class that they wish they took. I know there's several I wish I had taken, and there's several I wish I hadn't, believe me. I was having this conversation with Andy Zimbos last night about my first interest in being an economist, and that did not go well, right? That did not go well. Thank God I found my way to American Studies. But that was like my fourth major. And I was lucky enough to be in an institution where I could do that thing, right? Where I didn't have to be slotted in for my first day on campus. And this is what athletes have to do, right? And be tracked in a way. And we know as educators, tracking is bad, but we do it to college athletes, right? Even when I was an academic professional, I did with all my athletes, right? And it wasn't necessarily because I thought this is an easy class, right? Many of my athletes end up in sociology because I knew the sociologists, right, had a framework to understand their experience and would treat them like people, right? Perhaps, and not to badmouth economists, but perhaps the economists wouldn't, right? So I think one of the things that we have to realize is that as college students, and we work with college students, there are going to be classes they're not going to take that they wish they would. And there are going to be classes that they take that they wish they wouldn't. And I think, again, think about the system. It's hard to say, to imagine a system with college athletics where being eligible isn't primary, but as long as eligibility is primary, folks are going to be slotted into tracks that don't necessarily fit what they want to know and how they want to know.
I mean, this view of academics is not unique to student athletes, by the way. I can think of several students who are not athletes who did not fully appreciate the value of the educational experience. So just for the record, Amy, or rather,
I think hopefully our landscape is changing now a little bit, where we're thinking about our careers in a different sort of way. So maybe that'll help in general, but it's what do you want to pursue? And then how do you get there? And I think we need to help all people figure that out. Heck, I'm still trying to figure that out, but now that I'm retired, what do I want to do? What did I always want to do that I didn't get the opportunity to do? And how can I do that now? So, but I also think it's so overwhelming for these young people at 18 years old to try to figure it out. And then to give them a full-time job with travel and lots of travel, some injuries that get in the way, and just other family situations that we all have. And especially a lot of the athletes who I worked with whose families were really depending on them to pull them out of poverty with their talent. So just so many layers to the onion. But I think we need to spend more time with students as they think about their athletic career, and how I just think having them do it all at the same time is just insane. Now that I look back on it 10 years ago and think about how we can make this system really work, where we can have our game days at our universities and our colleges and we can enjoy them, but we also are not exploiting the athletes. And I think it just goes so much further than just paying athletes and the NIL. I mean, I think there's just so much more to that, because for me, and of course I'm an educator, so for me, the academic piece of it, and I'm going to channel our friend Jerry Gurney here too. For us, that academic piece of it is so important and so critical, and such a way to have a better life. So I think we're just not, I know we're further along than we were, but we're just not there yet. So I think we just need to continue to work on educating each other and to educating our young people into how to make better choices and how to get, what is Jonathan, he said, how to get something for what they're taking. We should also get something, right?
Richard, do you want to weigh in on this, Richard?
I do. One of the things that started during the racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd and others was that a lot of athletic departments started, first of all, they brought us in to advise them. And one of the first things we advised is that they have a DE&I training for all student athletes to put our society that they're being raised in perspective. And some of the schools are also having training programs in athlete activism, because, all of my lifetime, I and other people have been trying to get athletes to become active, and every time they did, they were shot down. But I think when the Milwaukee Bucks didn't come out in the NBA, in the bubble in the NBA playoffs, and the NBA not only didn't penalize them, but shut the entire league down, and the rest of the sports did as well, to focus on the shooting that had taken place in Kenosha and other shootings. I think we have an opportunity to put our athletes in that context of where they're being raised and why life is like it is in America. And I've seen enormous growth of anybody who goes through DE&I training in understanding the role that they might be able to play as well.
There was quite a bit of conversation on the first panel about NIL and the extent to which NIL may impact academic performance and success. No discussion of legalized sports betting on campuses. What do you think? Is there a connection between performance academically and a world in which maybe half the people attending a game have a wager on whether you make a foul shot or not?
I think I can start with this. I'm not exactly sure how I want to answer that specific question yet. Maybe I need to think about that a little bit, but I think it's interesting that the lessening of regulations around athletes being seen and paid for their value happens at the same time of the lessening of regulations around people being able to bet on their value, right? I think those two things go hand in hand. There's something about that. And I can, we've had conversations about this in our Drake group meetings. I can imagine that it's really stressful to understand that folks are betting on your performance at that level and what that might bring to you in terms of your performance in the field of play, and also in how you want to prepare for that performance in the field of play, and not taking something away from your academic pursuits and like I said earlier, your pursuit of other kinds of collegiate experiences as well.
I just see it as another distraction. And for such young people to just be distracted by all the social media and then now the betting, I mean, it just gets bigger and bigger, how many distractions there can be. And to me, the piece that's going to suffer, of course, I'm going to say it because I'm a teacher and an educator, but it always seems to be the academic piece that's going to suffer. And then I think, how can it get worse? But it just seems like that's maybe the pendulum has to swing so far before it swings back. But I don't think any of these are necessarily a good. I think some of them are good for students and fair for the students, for the athletes who deserve so much more. But just seems like it's just too much and too confusing and too distracting. So I don't know. I don't know what it would be like to be. I think some of those athletes were asked at our panel what it would be like now, well, back in the day, right? So much easier. Seems so complicated.
I would have loved to have gone to my neighborhood barber when I was in college and gotten a free haircut. I got a haircut, it was maybe once a month, right? And when that week came, that $10, and it was a $10 haircut then, right? I take my son to the barbershop now, it's like $50. I'm like, what are you talking about? But I would have loved to have not chosen between a pizza and a haircut that week.
Yeah, so there's definitely some good. Absolutely, there's some of these decisions have been good, but then it just seems like it opened up a whole nother can of worms. So some bad came with the good, and maybe that's always the way it is. But
I just wish I needed to go to the barber.
I would have also loved to have gone to the neighborhood Ben and Jerry's where they knew my order when I walked in, right? And the Dunkin' Donuts, dozen, Bruce? Yeah, sure, I'll take a dozen, right? And the Junkyard Dog, the hot dog place was great.
Richard, sports betting?
When Adam Silver made the decision to get involved in it, I was stunned and thought it was going to be a disastrous situation for the leagues. It's now one of the biggest revenue sources for the leagues. I haven't seen the disaster part that I thought was probably going to happen, but I think doing it at the college level is just more dangerous than at the pro level.
I have one more question for the group. So all of us, we see sports, I think, in a slightly different way than the average fan. I guess we're fans, but if we're fans, we're fans in a different way. Do you enjoy going to a live sporting event and just watching the event play out? Or are you at a remove from that, given what you do professionally?
I'll start. Yeah. I can remember a conversation I had with a classmate when I was in graduate school, and we were talking about going to the movies, and we were just getting through the part in our program where we learn how to analyze media, right? And I remember her saying, I can't go to the movies anymore and just enjoy a movie. I'm looking at every message, right? And I think there's some of that in the question that you're asking, right, Mark? It's hard to go to a college football game now and look at the 100,000 spectators, knowing what we know about how the sausage is made, right? And knowing what we know about how to analyze that process and enjoy it the same way. Believe me, I try my best. I want to go to the game and have a whole bunch of fun like everybody else, right? I want to tailgate and have a bunch of fun like everybody else. And, enjoy the game for what it is and enjoy the athletes for their accomplishments and all the skill that they bring to that thing. And it's really, really difficult to do that. I think that's a really interesting question.
I mean, we lived right on campus at the University of North Carolina. We raised our kids there. And so they went to all the games and so did we. But as they got older, they could go. It was so fun for them and bring their friends. And one of my kids was a bat boy for Carolina too. And he has such great memories of that. And I just remember seeing him in the dugout, having so much fun. But around the time that I spoke publicly about the paper class system and some of the other inequities in the system, it wasn't the same for me anymore. So I'm kind of to the point where the only sports I go to are the ones that I'm a player, like my own little running or kayaking or biking. So I guess it doesn't really count anymore. But yeah, I'm kind of done, really.
Richard.
I enjoy going to UCF men's and women's basketball games because I know the coaches have both been dedicated to their student athletes. I know that we have, as an entire athletic department, either the second highest academic progress rate and the first graduation rate in the country. So they're doing it right as far as I can see, and I'm pretty close to it. But when I see programs that I know that's not the case, I am very uncomfortable at this point.
I think we're ready for questions if there are any. Yes, this gentleman. Right here. Yes.
Hello, how you doing? My name is Lawrence Carroll Jr. I attend Virginia State University, hyper major.
Hail State.
Hail State. I wanted to ask you a question, Bruce. I wanted to ask, do you feel like colleges need to be more diverse for Black college students to succeed?
I think that's a great question. And the Hail State comes from my parents both being graduates of Virginia State. And I'm really, really happy to see the Virginia State table here. So I think sense of belonging is a really big aspect, a big component to academic success for all students. After I left academic work with athletes, I did DEI specific work on a bunch of different college campuses. From being a director of African-American Student Affairs at Arizona and director of the Black and African-American Culture Center at Colorado State, and then an assistant dean for inclusion and engagement success at a small private school in Portland. And when I worked my way up to vice president, the DEI stuff was really important to me. And I would lead these conversations around sense of belonging. And the diversity question is a part of the first component to me of what sense of belonging is. And we've talked about this, right? We talked about folks coming to campus and feeling like the campus represents who they are, right? That they have role models around them, that they see people who like them having success on the campus, that they can see themselves in the campus and being successful in that space, right? So more diverse is great, absolutely. And there are other aspects to that, right? The inclusion and engagement part, the equity part are really, really important also. And folks have to feel affirmed, right? They have to feel an affinity to the institution, and they have to give real strong, meaningful feedback as well. So for those three things, the sense of belonging part is really important. And we can translate that to what it means to be an athlete and a Black athlete on the campus, right? When folks are telling you that you don't belong, or literally telling you that you and your peers don't belong, right? Whether it's because of the color of your skin, the place that you come from, or because of the sport that you play, there's an assumption that you don't belong, right? And part of this conversation, I think, has to include that understanding, that in order for us to do our work around reforming college sports and ensuring that we live up to the promise of an education, we have to be able to understand that context very well.
I can do this because I grabbed the mic, but I have a question for Mary Willingham. One of the things that was disappointing about the first panel session is that we had predominantly graduate people who had been successful at graduation. And one of the real things we wanted to get across with this program was who is not graduating. So my question to you is, what do we really know about the kid who does not graduate? Are they stupid? Should they be in the classroom? Do we have data on that? You at UNC did one of the largest studies of kids who did not graduate, especially admitted students. And I'm really curious what you found out.
So the data set that I had where I tracked some students who literally tracked from 2005 all the way till about the time that the university found out, and then they had at me, so about 2012, which by the way, they had given us permission to do it, but then they pulled the permission. But we have the data that, and it's actually sitting at the College Sports Research Institute, where I have all of the work that I walked away with, the transcripts and so on, and this data set. So if any of you want to study any of it, you can go to the University of South Carolina and find the Willingham collection, and it's all there. And it's been looked at by attorneys and de-identified and all of that, of course. But that data set with about 183 to about 186 athletes during that time period. So we won during that time period too. We won a couple of basketball championships, and our football team got better, and all the other sports as well. We're doing soccer, baseball, lots of championships. So these are some elite college athletes, many of whom, somewhere around 30 to 40 a year or more, were specially admitted to the university. So they were underprepared, I would say, as a learning specialist and reading specialist for the academic rigor of the institution. We did IQ testing. If you think IQ testing is fair and equitable, 99% were at or above average IQ. So it has nothing to, if you can play sport at Division I, for crying out loud, you are not just gifted athletically, but you are also gifted, from a cognitive standpoint. So there was no question that these young people in this data set could do the work. They could absolutely do the work, but along the way, they had played sports so much or had been at not such great K-12 institutions, probably public schools. They were not prepared for the academic rigor. And so what happens is, because of the paper class system, we could keep many of them eligible. And many of them did graduate, but many of them didn't, because what hung them up were like the math requirement or the foreign language requirement, those requirements that would be really hard to cheat in. I mean, and it's not them. I'm not saying the students did it. The university was, so many people knew that this system of eligibility had existed for so long. But so really, if we're going to let students in the front door of an institution that are not prepared, but we're going to tell them that we're going to use their talent, then we should give them what we promised them, which is what I always go back to saying. So you hear me repeat, but there is a way we could do it. I truly believe that. We just have to figure out how long it's going to take, and how with all these time commitments and NIL and all this crazy stuff that goes on, like, how are we going to do it? But it's what we promised them, and it's what we promised their families, and they can do it. And I would argue that the students I met, hundreds over the 9 to 9 years that I was at Carolina in the athletic department, 7, and then a couple more that I spent in the college, they want to do it. They want an education. They recognize the value of the education. They want their moms to come to graduation and see them graduate. Like, that's really important to them. So that's why I went down the path of being a whistleblower, because I can see all their faces, right? And I know that they deserve so much better from us. And I know that we can do better. And we should have done better. So that's, but I'm answering your question from the standpoint of it's not that myth of the dumb jock or whatever, that should go away completely because. Right. So a lot of these students that we tested too, like an overwhelming number of 40%, 45% show that they had some learning differences, right? So some attention issues or some learning differences, which, I mean, in our general population now, we're seeing, like I have a friend who teaches at Duke in the nurse practitioner program. She says a third of her graduate students coming in get some accommodations. I mean, so the number has really risen because we're just doing more testing. But we found that the population with athletes, and why is that? Is it that their processing speed, either slower or faster, makes them good at sport, or is it that they weren't so good at school because they struggled because they had some sort of learning difference, and so then they focused on their sport and became better at sport? We don't really know what that all means, but from an educator, it means that they can learn. They just need to know, we need to help them with the strategies for their particular brain so that they can, get the knowledge in there and learn. And so that's a big part of it too, that I don't think we're really talking about or focusing on when we're talking about, like Coach Staley said about the programming. Like each individual student needs different, especially if they come into the institution underprepared, they're going to need some different types of support. So we need to do it though, because we've told them that we're going to promise them the education, and it can get kind of complicated. There's not enough reading specialists, learning specialists. I mean, look at the shortage of teachers just in K-12 in general. So it's just getting harder and harder.
Mary, do you know of a Division I institution that's doing what you're describing or something close to it?
I mean, I do not know that anybody's doing it, but maybe some of you are doing it, or some of you know that there's an institution up. Again, I was sent back to K-12 after my whistleblowing at the university. So I kind of am more familiar with what's happening there now.
Yes.
Over here. She needs a microphone.
I'll get it back.
Oh, then you're
Yes,
next. Pass it back to him, yeah.
So I had a question. I too worked in academic support at our college. I'm from Delaware State University. And we also specially admit students, and we also had student athletes that were participating. But we had a program, a summer bridge program, where they came in the summer. So I found that students that went through those kinds of behavioral changes or practice prior to coming to school seemed to do a lot better than those students that didn't. And I always wondered if student athletes had the opportunity to, during the summers, to have that extra support, because they come for camps every summer for the practice, but they don't come to practice what we call academic behaviors. And I'm finding out that a lot of our students struggle with academic behaviors. You're right, they're not dumb. It's just that they haven't been exposed on how you're supposed to do it. And we did summer bridge for at least 12 years, and those students always outperformed the cohort that they came in with, but the student athletes outperformed them. And a lot of us asked, well, why? And at the time, we were finding out that the study hall worked, the coach, and the academic advisor that was over the student athletes really supported the students. But I'm at a HBCU. So it is a little different in the sense that many of the people that worked at our college look like us, but many of them don't. Dr. Blade, and she's really phenomenal at what she does. So I just wanted to, talk about that as one educator to another.
Yeah, and I think you do supplemental instruction too, probably. And that's
Yeah,
another,
yes.
yeah,
We did
that's
that,
another, I see that
tutoring.
the HBCUs do a lot of supplemental instruction. Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's good.
If I could quickly, the summer bridge program that I work with at Cal was incredibly successful for a number of different reasons, including that the athletes who took to participate, well, one, the bridge program was not run by the athletic department. It was run by the student life department, right? And the athletes who participated didn't live with other athletes, they lived with non-athletes, right? So immediately when they came to campus, I think this was like the beginning of July, they developed an academic identity, right? They weren't there just to be athletes, and they weren't catered to because of their athletic abilities. They were catered to because they were Summerbridge students, right? And that was a really big part of the success of that program.
My name is Brandon Kimball, and I'm a faculty member at Virginia State University. I want to say thank you to you all. Richard, no stranger to Virginia State University, and Dr. Bay. We've had a few of our students that left Virginia State, and our undergraduate sport management program has gone to UNCF. But my question, I'm a former academic advisor in the athletic department. What has been some of the conversations you've had, Bruce and Mary, with athletes about transitioning from playing into careers, or maybe even now entrepreneurship, as well as some of the strategies that you use? I'd be curious to know some of those, if you don't mind sharing.
So when I was lucky, I got to have 4 and 5 year relationships with athletes, with my students, right? And that conversation that you're asking about happened over the course of that 4 or 5 years. And you get a person who's 18 and is not thinking about career. I wasn't thinking about career when I was 18, right? To a person, when they leave and they're 22 years old, and they've had this experience as an athlete, had this experience as a student. And if they're fortunate, they've had some collegiate experiences as well, right? Where they've been to a career fair or two, they've been to the career center. And that's really, they're really, as athletes, not many of them do that, right? Maybe they've been exposed to some events where networking. Athletes have some chance to do that, right? And they have an understanding of what's waiting for them in the world, right? So that conversation happens over the course of that experience. And I think the strategy is not just about the conversation that you get to have with them, but the people that you get to set them up with, right? Who do they get to talk to? And I was really fortunate as an athlete. One of the things that was best for me as a college athlete is I got to meet a whole bunch of people who did a whole bunch of stuff in a whole bunch of places. Coach Mateo coaches at Woodbury Forest School. One of my mentors was a graduate of Woodbury Forest and asked me to be the person that Coach Mateo is now, right? And he exposed me to people in DC politics and DC law and all these things. No, I'm neither a politician nor a lawyer, but that being able to expose students to that thing, I think is really important.
And I don't, at Carolina, again, it was 10, now I'm 10 years, well, 8 years gone, but there wasn't really very much happening. And that's a problem. And then the career center is not probably a super friendly place for especially our Black athletes, because it's North Carolina and it's white privileged, so that was always a question that I had too, is how are we going to help these young people network? How are we going to help our college athletes network with people and places that they want, with mentorships, so that they can be exposed to the careers that they're interested in as their plan B. Many of these young people think they're going to go professional, so that's always part of it too. And then, but you have to get them to think about, well, what else? Well, what if you do go professional, but then, you're still going to have so many years left, even if you play in your sport. So what do you want to do if, trying to get them to think around that. But I don't think we do enough. I would say that we still don't do enough with that. We need to do more and make sure they have these meaningful experiences, internships, mentorships, and also to the places that they want to live too.
So there's a question here and here and there. Yeah.
So should I go
Yes,
first? Yeah, I'm John Kilborn. I was Coach Brown's graduate assistant at UCLA and was an assistant coach with his Sixers. And we won a world championship 40 years ago. And then I did my dissertation at Ohio State on the development of curriculum for college athletes. And Bruce, you mentioned earlier that faculty drive an institution. And then many of you mentioned about a meaningful education. And the question I have asked for 30 plus years is, why aren't there courses for college athletes? Why can't they fill their history requirement with the history of sport class, and their philosophy requirement with the philosophy of sport class, and their science requirement with athletic injury prevention? We bring thousands of college athletes, men and women, to schools, and they learn absolutely nothing about what many of them are interested in doing. So I just have, I would like your feelings on that. Why can't they take courses in some bona fide courses with other students, as Bruce said, when your summer program, so they have these conversations about things that they are really interested in.
I would have loved to have majored in being a college athlete. Right. I have a colleague at Cal who worked really hard on building a curriculum around a major that would prepare. I don't know if the word is prepare, but it was basically an athletic studies major. I thought it was brilliant. I think it speaks volumes that institutions that generate so much revenue off of a thing don't think that thing is, that there's a framework to study that thing, or that it's worth studying.
We are over time at this point. Maybe those of you with questions for the panel can just come to the front of the room and speak to us privately. I think that's probably the best way to handle it.
Sounds good to me.
I want to thank Donna Lupiano and the Drake Group for inviting me to sit in this seat. And I want to thank Mary and Bruce and Richard for really, really interesting. Was it 90 minutes? Feels like about 15 to me. So, and Don. So thank you very much.